congratulations for what you have made this far. My name is Kana. I am sitting at the front with me, Akhil and Alex. We're going to see a good debate today. So without any further ado, on the motion that this House is banned transfer pricing, I invite the private to start the debate.
Mr. Speaker, we tell you that huge corporations with different legal entities use transfer pricing as a method to manufacture prices to ensure that they skew markets, to also ensure that they evade taxation. What we intend to do on site government today is very simple. We intend to ban transfer pricing. That is that all products that are traded even within the same corporation and different legal entities which have different shareholders, we tell you that all products should be traded at market prices if the logistics of those states, or should be at least like open to the markets. If the logistics of that is too hard, they should at least show that all transactions were made at the market price and no transaction was made lower than the transaction price just because they belong to the same like large corporate, right? So what do we tell you are the harms that currently exist that we need to change to? We see three big problems. Firstly, we tell you that they evade taxes and there's a lack of payback to society. Secondly, we tell you there's a huge whale of misinformation that these companies can make use of in order to skew markets to make it profitable for themselves and the top executive and the board of executives, and make it extremely harmful for the shareholders that own the own shares of that company. They can also create speculation and on especially which financial markets work on, and therefore create manufactured prices in order to ensure that more their shares are either more valuable or there's more speculation of their shareholders of their shares, right? Firstly, what do we think is the principal reason we need to stop companies from having transfer pricing? We tell you what most often these companies do is, even if they're a profitable entity, which we will argue as is a consequence of society and taxation, we tell you that these companies necessarily use these transfer pricing to invest or to like sell products at lower prices, at manufactured prices to other legal entities, therefore not showing profit at that price or for that corporation, and therefore evade tax on those profits. We tell you that it's important to understand this because the amount that they're giving back to society as a taxation on the profit is largely reduced because they're simply able to transfer the money that they have in the profit that they have in this company to another company which is less profitable, in order to ensure at lower prices, in order to ensure that both companies don't necessarily have any sort of profit, therefore evading tax by a huge margin. Why is this problematic? We tell you that any company that necessarily is invested in countries necessarily makes use out of state structures which are dependent on taxation. How do we tell you this? These huge companies in most developed countries and many other countries necessarily use state infrastructure such as roads, such as buildings, whatever, right? So we tell you that these are state invested like entities which necessarily are a formulation or a function of the taxes that everybody else pays. The common notion about taxation is that everybody pitches in and therefore everybody constructs a society that is beneficial for everyone. At a point of time, you're taking huge amounts of tax money and making use out of that and making sure that you get a profit and you never pay back. It's especially problematic for everybody that is already paying tax because you're never giving back to the society. We also tell you it's particularly problematic because they use state infrastructure very hugely, right? Examples of road are already dealt with, but more importantly, things like state endorsed education, which ensures that they get better kind of employees and so on and so forth. So the reason that the companies need to pay back tax is because so that the state can invest more, and therefore a lot more other individuals apart from these huge companies can also benefit from it, given that they have like ensured that they get benefits from state infrastructure and taxation. Secondly, and we tell there is huge whale of misinformation which these people can use in order to make sure that transfer pricing is beneficial for themselves, but not necessarily beneficial for everybody else, right? Firstly, there are two people that we think especially get harmed. The first are the shareholders of these public companies as well. Why do we think this is so? We tell you these shareholders necessarily invest in these companies assuming that they're likely to be profitable and therefore derive benefits out of that stock price being high or out of those profits getting distributed amongst all the public shareholders. More often than not, what we see is that CEOs have different legal entities within the same company, where the shareholders don't invest in that entity, and therefore what necessarily ends up happening is that you can simply transfer the profit that you got into that other entity, and therefore ensure that you gain profits from as a consequence of you pushing money into that entity because it's profitable for you, but is not necessarily profitable for the shareholders that necessarily invested in this. We tell you that the very good example of this is the Kingfisher example that happened in India. Vijay Mallya, when he had multiple legal entities, but there was a huge shareholding in Kingfisher Airlines, but not so much in Kingfisher. He owned a lot more stocks in Kingfisher breweries. What he simply did was whatever profits he generated out of Kingfisher Airlines, he simply pushed it to Kingfisher breweries, and therefore making a lot of profit for himself. But at the point of time when the airlines crashed and all his public shareholders lost money, he simply claimed bankruptcy because Kingfisher Airlines was not making huge amounts of profit. Therefore, he was simply able to evade the idea that Kingfisher Airlines is a profitable activity, and therefore was able to deny these shareholders of any sort of accountability or responsibility. Right? The third idea that we propose to you is the idea of speculation and how you can manufacture prices when you can buy and sell from your own company. The way financial markets work is purely based on speculation and the number of people buying your shares and the amount of shares being bought and at prices that are decided by the market, right? So when you are able to skew the market, where you're able to buy and sell quite a lot within your own legal entities and at prices that you you can decide amongst yourself, the problem that happens is that you can create speculation in order to skew market prices. So if Parth and I are different legal entities in the same company, I can simply keep buying and selling within our own company, within our own legal entities, in order to speculate the idea that our stock is so valuable that a lot of people are buying and selling. Therefore, the trend that the financial market works on, basically any amount of financial analysis, any technical analysis you do in terms of a day trade or a long-term trade, is always based on the idea of how many shares are bought, how many shares are sold. Therefore, companies can easily buy and sell shares at a huge rate, and therefore increasing this idea of speculation, and therefore ensuring that either the stock price is so high or the trend of people buying your stock is increased at a point of time where you own a lot of stocks. You can simply cash in and make a lot of money without ever being the profitable entity that you are, and therefore people invest in you. The idea of a financial market is that or the idea of a free market is you have the best product, and therefore people come to you with the best product. Okay, the idea of that market is that the best, like people or with the best product necessarily gain the most amount of competitive advantage in that market. The problem with this is that the market gets largely skewed. I have no idea what the time is. 7. Okay. The biggest problem that we see in today's debate is that if you have transfer pricing, markets are skewed, therefore shareholders are skewed, taxpayers are skewed, as well as the speculative buyers who are largely skewed. The only people who are benefiting are these horrible capitalists who make a lot of money out of this.
From side opposition, we think transfer pricing is not only good, but it's also a necessary thing for the society, for the states, for the taxpayers, and for the shareholders and everybody in society. We think that transfer pricing is a good thing from opposition. Right? So before I move on to my substantives, which are going to be about how corporate efficiency, especially from MNCs, and related to transfer pricing is a very good and necessary thing, and my deputy is going to talk about how their model at the end of the day isn't really going to solve the root cause of the problem they are analyzed. But before that, I'm going to talk about a couple of points of rebuttals, right? So their first point was about how states provide infrastructure, provide roads and education for employment, so they rightly deserve to benefit from the tax that these companies should be rightfully paying, right? We think that no, because when you think about it, right, the states also receive things that they, under your standard, don't necessarily deserve. How so? Because when it comes to MNCs, they're not just a domestic presence, but they're an international presence. And that has a very, very significant meaning. We think that the expertise or the management know-how, the education that you bring as an MNC to the employment of that domestic country, or maybe the value added abroad, right? Because when you don't create a product only in one country, but you add value to that product from numerous countries, in numerous processes across numerous local subsidiaries. So when you sell that product or manufacture that product in that domestic area, those people are not benefiting only from that domestic process, and the international process as a whole. We think that also when it comes to the job that these MNCs provide, the kind of quality of jobs or the number of jobs that these MNCs are able to provide are only able to exist because these are an international huge presence, right? You wouldn't have that amount of jobs that provided by these MNCs in that local area if it weren't for that international presence in the first place. We think that on the last and most obvious level, the kind of products or the services that these MNCs provide to that domestic area or to those consumers or those taxpayers that you analyze is only possible because they have an international presence, because they're a huge global market and a huge global company that can provide the best quality products at the best price for these consumers. That's the reason why these states and these taxpayers are getting more than they deserve in the first place. So this is an imbalanced trade. This is not an imbalanced trade-off. We think that this is true for the shareholders as well. Why? Because when it comes to the shareholders, it's not only about the local subsidiary itself, but the kind of stability or the profitability that this brand as a whole, that this MNC as a whole can provide, and these shareholders benefit directly from, is only possible because of the international brand. When it comes to Coca-Cola or Apple or whatever, or Hyundai, there are a lot of local subsidiaries, but all these local subsidiaries benefit and have more lucrative shares because there is international presence. So we think that it's a much balanced trade-off at the end of the day. So thank you, sir. But then to move on to my substantives. My first substantive of our corporate efficiency, right? We think that first we need to compare MNCs on the international level to companies when we analyze them on a domestic level, right? We think that when it comes to the domestic level, less companies of a lesser size, we think that when they pursue measures that are legal or are efficient, we have no problem with it. Why? We expect it to be legal. We expect it to be efficient. We expect them to be profitable because that's what companies are about. We think, especially when it comes to state-run enterprises, we criticize them for not being efficient, for not being able to find a smart way to make more money. We think when it comes to the domestic level, these things are necessary to survive because you have to compete with other companies. We think when it comes to the international level, it's the exact same thing. Why? Because when it comes to the MNCs, right, they have to compete with other MNCs in order to survive in the international market. We think that there's a status quo perception that these MNCs are big and rich and therefore are somehow evil. We think that this is wrong and very detrimental of a status quo like bias on two different levels. The first is that the size of these MNCs are an achievement of efficiency, quality, and able to beat your competitors. Right? We think that this is something to be celebrated and something to be actually proud of and try to aspire towards, rather than being jealous of them because they're rich and they're capable. We think that this kind of perception and this kind of size is something we need to actually celebrate. We think that these are the exact values that we seek and we praise in other corporations on domestic levels, especially when it comes to shareholders or like the people that benefit from the society because of these products or services. On the second level, we think that the size is beneficial to society. We think that MNCs are very, very important and need to exist in the international market, and the transfer pricing is a very important part of this. How so? Well, thank you. We think that when it comes to intra-firm trade, meaning that when we have local subsidiaries under the same brand or the same like big MNC trading within each other on an international level, even though they're in the same term and they're like from the same local branch, that kind of intra-firm trade it takes up more than half of international trade volume in the world today. We think this kind of intra-firm trade is especially important in actually revitalizing economy, revitalizing people, and actually creating jobs, creating more GDPs, creating all these things that we hold so dear. We think that when it comes to businesses like Walmart, Nike, McDonald's, Coca-Cola, like Hyundai or IKEA, all these big international MNCs are an extremely important presence in the society today. Without these companies actually leading the international market, without these MNCs pursuing what they do best and being efficient by utilizing methods such as transfer pricing, we wouldn't have the kind of economic size of trade or benefits or employment that we see in the world today. We think that, for example, when we look at Walmart, right, the size of their revenue on an annual basis is equal to the GDP of the 28 20th largest country in the world. All these important insights, all these important things that are achieved through fair basis, through fair mechanisms, are something that we need to be proud of and love. Before I move on, yes.
Okay, the reason you institute income tax, even though you can spend money and buy other services and can help other people, is because there's equitable distribution of the amount of money that you have gained, right? Tell us why that's not a fair metric.
We think that when the benefits that these MNCs provide are on an international level, and that the benefits that they provide to society can only be there because of their international presence, we think that them using that international presence to pay less tax, to be more efficient, is something that is not an imbalanced trade-off, but rather a necessary and most absolutely natural trade-off that can only happen in the society today. We think that when it comes to developing countries especially, the presence of MNCs is extremely important. We think that the kind of countries that you try to analyze that have lesser taxes, lesser regulations towards these big companies, have these kind of looser tax policies on purpose, right? Because they want to host these MNCs, local branches, in their country because they depend on them to actually revitalize the economy, to actually gain trade, to gain investment, to create jobs for the developing country economy. We think that when you actually ban transfer pricing, what happens? We think that it is harmful on two levels. The first is that ultimately you condemn these MNCs' ability to pursue efficiency. The reason they're big is because they're efficient, because they're smart. When you ban that, when you disable their ability to do what they do best, then you can't have the same size of benefit that you see in the status quo today. We think that's extremely harmful. On the second level, we think it's extremely harmful to developing countries. Because when you ban transfer pricing, now these big MNCs have less incentives to actually create local branches in other developing countries that have less like stricter tax regulations. Then you ultimately disable these developing countries' ability to actually have a thriving economy to provide jobs for its citizens. And we think that at the end of the day, because MNCs are a necessary thing, and because transfer pricing is a necessary thing for these MNCs to do what they do best, we are very proud of it.
And discuss the idea of how taxation works and extend the idea that the places where you've housed your home institution or organization are being harmed, but more importantly on the idea that it's good for the international community. We'll argue that it's not even good for the countries that set up these tax havens because they had a reason to do that and that reason got lost, right? Those are the two things I want to discuss. After which, again, the idea of why the wheel of misinformation allows you to screw over the shareholders and the individuals who invest in a company and who have the right to have free and fair information, but transfer pricing allows to create an image that isn't true. But before going on, the idea that they submit to us is that MNCs have international presence and hence they ought not to pay taxes. My first response is who decides whether or not to pay taxes, right? The states offer you a service at the price of a tax. As an institution or a corporation, you choose to take that service or not. But what you cannot do is an MNC take that service and then decide, I'm sorry, I think I've done enough for you, and then walk off with the tax you ought to have paid. That's the first response, right? Who gets to decide? where does this argument head logically? The logical end of this argument is that if we recognize that the benefits you provide to our states are big, then the state gives you tax breaks. But at the point at which states don't give you tax breaks, you don't get to transfer this money into tax havens and evade taxes we expected from you. A. B. Also answer this question for me. A bigger corporation who has a bigger ability to generate money because a larger capital gets to evade taxes, while smaller companies which are creating jobs probably the same rate if put cumulatively are trapped in the same vicious cycle. If at all we want to give tax breaks, to defend why MNCs is the best place to allow them to run away by paying taxes. But the only other response, concrete response, was that it creates jobs. We think that's not as a response enough, because and that was the question was Parshin, right? He said when jobs are created, especially in big MNCs, only like a very few individuals get to reap the benefits. But the idea is this: the state produced these individuals through its education, healthcare, and road, and you use the services of the individual. We think a state has a bit or has a part of that individual's ability is in the ownership of the state. The state is not just responsible towards him but towards other people. When you as a corporate uses services, indirectly you use the services that the state provided to that individual, and hence you ought to pay that tax. So the idea that we're okay if we get away by because you already you have created a job for that individual. We think the state had a role to play in it. The state had a responsibility towards the poorer section. Since we did something for you, you ought to do something for us. And that was the logic of taxation we gave you, right? Quid pro quo is the largest concept of quid pro quo in the world, and we ought to uphold it. On the idea of it's good for the international community, there's something I don't know if it was explicitly present, but I think they were arguing that because it's international presence, it's good for the humanity by and large, it's good for society by and large. And we attack this idea again. Because understand this: why do countries give tax breaks? Because they want individuals to come and live there, because they want to spur the growth and economy, right? Which means when individuals come and start living here, people will have to build houses for them. If people come start living here, we'll have to buy cars in my country. If they come start living here, they'll have to hire drivers, etc., right? Which allows the economy to grow upwards. However, when you create dummy companies like Philip Morris does, all you do is shove money in there because you don't have to pay taxes. Do you hire the same number of people that you ought to have? No, because you've not actually established a functioning company there. You only established a dummy company that's that's used as evading taxes. Which means if it's a dummy company, the people, the educated mass, they expected to come in, they were ready to give a tax break to you for some benefits. Those benefits are never accrued because individuals don't come. The same kind of economy spurring doesn't happen, and hence we think you've even cheated the country that you entered. But before and now we'll argue about ideas of veil of misinformation, etc. And I think the best example of veil of misinformation and how it's misleading the entire world is exactly what he said. He said a large volume, in fact more than half in the finance world is through intra-bank trading, right? Where banks are trading within each other. And in fact, finance is the one place that transfer pricing should definitely be banned. What was the value that he showed? He said, since so much volumes are being traded, look how well our economy is doing, and look how many people are getting hired. No, because these kind of transfers are done by computers to optimize the kind of taxation you're paying anyways. So the people you're hiring aren't getting hired anywhere. A. B. It's not spurring business, because understand this, Kanna. If we keep exchanging $100 amongst each other, it doesn't allow for growth of businesses. The reason lending and paying back works is because we give capital to people who have the ability to invest that capital. But if that capital keeps getting transferred within each other to show pseudo growth of economy, that's bad. Because what it also does, it doesn't let you get a sense of economy and invest better. But on the idea of how bad, go for it.
It isn't intra-firm trade itself that creates an economic violation. It's ability to do that and be efficient. And at the end of it, have more capital to do actual things, to create actual jobs that are helpful.
Okay, if my total corpus of money remains the same, my ability to his argument is somehow that capital creates jobs and creates efficiency. That's the argument. but he doesn't show how transfer pricing allows for this capital generation. He needs to prove the link between transfer pricing being that linchpin to the efficiency he's arguing for. All he argues is that they're big, they're efficient, they do transfer pricing. But why is transfer pricing crucial to their efficiency? I never got to know. What we tell you, there's a veil of misinformation. The people who invest in these companies don't have the ability to understand all sort of trades. The first type of argumentation we argued was a trend argumentation, right? Where shares are bought and sold. But on another idea of revenues, right? We think the future speculation of companies happen on revenues. A point in case, WhatsApp. WhatsApp profits were WhatsApp losses were in millions of dollars. However, Facebook still bought WhatsApp in like one of the highest takeovers ever. Why so? Because the revenue was huge. You understand when an entity does a lot of business, you are ready to invest in it. Now what happens? When shareholders invest in a legal entity, at the end of each year, each financial year, they get a report of that legal entity, where I can show higher and boomed up revenues than I expected, which means now I'm ready to invest higher amount of capital. We think the people who are putting this money in deserve free and fair information, and due to transfer pricing and due to appearingly different entities, but by being controlled by similar individuals, they're able to manipulate the investors, they're able to manipulate markets, because when I transfer shares from one to the other, I can manipulate market pricing as well, right? We think the ability to manipulate is lying in a few people's hand. You're evading taxes, you're not helping the developed nations, you aren't helping the nations that give you those tax breaks. I'm still to find out how transfer pricing increases the efficiency. Very proud of the polls.
Alright, I think if you want to speak,
Coming from the government side, all we heard from their side was that the demonization of multinational corporations and the demonization of tax evasion. But coming from the opposition side, we're going to prove to you how tax evasion is actually the most efficient and most legal method that we have in the status quo, on how multinational corporations are enabled and facilitated to work and operate with the most efficiency, right? And we're also going to prove to you how even in the status quo, multinational corporations are not as, demonized or not as evil as they portray them to be, right? But before moving on to our substantive, I would like to give you some rebuttal. So let's talk about market price first. Sure, they talk about how market price is the most ideal option that we have in the status quo, but that's not necessarily true. But that's not necessarily true. When we're dealing, sure, market price sounds good when you're dealing with a free market with consumers and buyers, right? But then we specifically contextualize this issue as intercompany transactions that are already in a controlled system, right? So we don't necessarily see why market price set by a free market is the best ideal choice when the system we're operating under is already controlled, right? And we also told you that coming from the previous speaker, that transfer pricing is a part of a big process of different parts of a product being assembled, right? And we believe that in the process, the value added in every single process of transfer pricing actually leads up to the final product having the most value added, and that's the market price that we're going for, right? So later at the end of the day, we prove to you how this actually produces the most optimal market price for the consumer. So they never prove to you how this system actually harms the consumers. And we told you that this actually does not have much substantial harm for the consumers, right? And second, let's talk about how they have this big problem with how multinational corporations are not giving much payback to the society, right? But at first level rebuttal, we actually think that it is a moral action that the corporation has the freedom to contribute or not, right? Never a prerequisite for the corporation to operate, and further, never a reason why a particular system should be banned, right? But then on the second level rebuttal, coming from the previous speaker, we already proved to you that the amount of international and domestic presence that multinational corporations by nature have the quantity and quality of employment provided by all these presence in all branches in all the countries are a form of payback to the society, right? Also, multinational corporations often associate and have some kind of contribution in other community service-based service-based programs. Like, for example, McDonald's has association with the Ronald McDonald House, which educates and actively provides health and education systems for poor children. We think that the social payback that they're talking about does not necessarily always have to come in financial and monetary form, right? We believe that multinational corporations already do have a lot of contribution in community-based services, and we also think that it is in their very incentive to do so, because it also has to do with corporate social responsibility and how they how they construct their brand image, right? For example, they talk about how the government is the only avenue in which education can be provided. But we're talking about education. We think it is also important that the corporations be able to provide the expertise, know-how, and the specific knowledge that is required for the job, not necessarily universal education, right? And only multinational corporations can do that. For example, when the Boston Consulting Group goes into Korea, for example, what they do is that they provide the expertise, knowledge, and know-how that is necessary for the job itself. And that is something that cannot be provided by the domestic government, right? We think that those types of specific knowledge, those types of specific marketing or business strategies, know-how that is given to domestic individuals, that is only achieved through multinational corporations, right? And we also prove to you that on the third level of rebuttal, it's not that the corporation is not paying any kind of tax, right? We think that they're using this method, this legal and efficient method, to actually maximize their profit in order to invest it into research and development and whatnot. And that leads on to the third rebuttal, that how they talk about how tax evasion is only going to lead to the profit of the company. Sure, when companies make profit, what happens with status quo is that it's in their very self-motivation and incentive to actually invest it into research and development, create better quality of products for their own company, provide better quantity and quality of implement for their own for their own sake, right? We actually think that when that kind of stability, when that kind of efficient profit maximization occurs, it even benefits the shareholders. How? Because when a company is stable, when a company is doing well, what happens is their stock prices go up, right? And we actually think that kind of financial return to the shareholders does make sense. So we actually think that shareholders don't lose as much as they portray to be. So moving on to our substantive, we're going to tell you why corporation is actually the best actor to price the goods and services, not any other entity like the government, through intervention, right? So let's talk about the nature of corporations. We think that although corporations are profit-oriented, we also think that they're very rational entities that know the logistics to accurately price the goods and services in intra-company transactions, right? It's intra-company transactions. The companies have the most knowledge. The companies know best what kind of price is suitable for their own intra-company transactions, not the government, right? We think that the companies best understand the profit and pricing system that their own corporation and branches operate under, and it actually aligns with the principle of corporate freedom, as long as it does not have any substantial harms in third parties, which they did fail to prove, right? But why is it also important that government does not ban the system? In the status quo, the transfer pricing system is not illegal for legitimate reasons, right? It is a method of corporations to maximize their profit while minimizing the tax. We think that the deduction of tax is always going to be utmost priority and utmost goal that corporation will strive to achieve, regardless of whether the system is existent or not, right? We think that it's one of those things that regardless of increased barrier or regardless of increased legal systems, we think that tax evasion and the maximization of profit, an efficient taxing system, is something that the corporations will always strive to achieve, and you can't solve that, right? We think that coming from their side, coming from the side, when the corporation is restricted from using this legal method, then what they will do as a profit-oriented entity, what they will do is that they will inevitably resort to other stealthier methods of maximizing their profit in order to confront greater taxing systems, right? Whether that be for resorting to cheaper wages or whatnot, right? We think that this actually is going to lead to a downward spiral in socioeconomic conditions, which actually goes against what multinational corporations are supposed to do, right? Coming from their side, they also have no solvency, right? You have to prove how the corporations will not resort to even more harmful, stealthier, and underground methods in evading tax, right? Because we think that the maximization of profit, cutting down taxes, efficient taxing system are always going to be the utmost priorities and utmost goals that corporations will strive to achieve, even regardless of this thing, right? So you have to prove to us, so you have to prove to us how this tax evasion system will be so dramatically alleviated or so dramatically solved, because we don't think that you did that. So we're very, very proud to oppose.
This debate is the first time I heard what transfer pricing does and how it is done in the real world. What it essentially happens is that Partha sits at like a US desk of Deutsche Bank and I sit at the India desk of Deutsche Bank. I make a loss of $3,000, but he's making a profit of $3,000 in the US. What transfer pricing does is it gives the ability for Deutsche Bank to tell Partha to transfer his profits into my desk, and I show that this is an incoming amount of cash flow into my desk. Therefore, I can limit my losses in this country. But what this does is it necessarily allows Deutsche Bank to claim no profits made at the source of where this cash flow arose at. And the problem with all of this is that this mechanism, although like they want to argue it is used to increase efficiency, what it is largely used to do is to evade taxes at countries where there is high taxation. Where are these countries? These countries are likely to be where infrastructure is already very conducive to you forming that company in the first place. Companies like Apple and companies like Google, all of them set up in the Silicon Valley because that is the most conducive environment for infrastructure conducive infrastructure that exists in the world right now. That's why investors are more likely to come to your company and invest in your company. That's the place where you're likely to find the best talent because Stanford is right next to your campus. All of this means is that US has, through its efforts in the past 50 years, been able to provide a sanctuary in that part of the world where everybody comes down to. What necessarily Apple is doing right now is pushing most of its profits through Asian shell companies and like transfer pricing between Asian companies to show very little profit. This is a company that has $1 trillion, close to $1 trillion in profits. This isn't a company that needs to not pay those taxes because it can't afford to run without paying those taxes. This is a company that is doing it simply because it can. If the argument on their side was that MNCs, and they're trying to argue in some level, that MNCs will fail if you don't like give them tax evasive routes, that's like preposterous. The reason that they are called MNCs is because they are so large that they have billions of dollars in cash reserves that they are able to spend. The reason why they funnel it through Asian tax havens or like Scandinavian tax havens is because they give them the ability to increase their profits. Let's look at largely what side opposition wanted to tell you in today's debate. The largest argument that they made was that in some at a macro level was that MNCs provide a unique value to countries, and that value is enough for us to provide tax evasive routes to them. Let's break down this argument in two sections. Right? In the first sections, do MNCs really provide value to those countries or to those societies? What kind of value do they thus provide? The kind of value that Apple provides to Silicon Valley cannot be translated to the rest of California. It exists only within Silicon Valley, and it exists only with people with MS majors in computer science. It doesn't translate to people working on the ground in other parts of the state forget even the nation, right? The idea behind taxation is that even if one part of the country or society is richer than the other part, we want to have some form of equitable distribution so that other parts come up. And it's important for us to recognize that the value that these MNCs give to society has to be looked at from the state perspective. What they argued was that tax evasion, or let's not make them defend tax evasion, let's make them defend tax reduction, right? Why should we reduce tax for MNCs? Here's the argument to that. We can reduce tax, we can increase the tax rates we give to MNCs as long as the states decide to do so. What they're defending is the independent call taken by companies to reduce the tax for themselves because it becomes more profitable for themselves. We think there's a problem with this stance because what they are saying is exactly what they said in their second speech. They're giving the ability to of companies to evade tax, not to lobby the state to reduce tax rates or show genuine reasons why you require reduced taxations, right? Now let's look at the second idea that they pushed through for most of those two speeches, right? They wanted to argue that this is the most efficient method because it gives them, like, the moment they set up legal, and they didn't make this argument, but what they were going for is that the moment I set up multiple legal identity, like legal entities with different nations, it becomes easier for me to control because I give control of that entity to somebody else and I insulate myself and all of that, right? They never made that argument. But let's look at why transfer pricing isn't a function of efficiency even in this method, even when you create legal entities. When, sure, you want to, like Virgin Atlantic, like Richard Branson wants to create a legal entity in some other nation and wants to have, say, Virgin Records located in some other country and have a different CEO so that he can insulate him from the losses that that company has. But the problem is that transfer pricing does the most abusive method of market. I don't know how to put it. Like, it controls the market in the most abusive way. How does it do so? Richard Branson can simply pull out or push in cash as and when he wants without applying market values to those shares that he's pushing in. What this means is that Richard Branson can, depending on the situation, and these companies do that, like multiple levels or different, depending on the situations, can get to either increase or lower share, like market prices, depending on how they want to make the company grow. Like, I'll give you an example, right? This is very similar to like insider trading. And exactly what they said, right? You have information on price patterns within your country within your company before anybody else gets to know. You know that Kingfisher Airlines will collapse in the next 6 months because you're the only one that is capable of seeing it because you haven't yet produced a tax report at the end of the financial year. You haven't produced an audit at the end of the financial year. You haven't revealed anything. You are the only person in the know-how as to how the company is likely to progress. But what you do in transfer pricing is to avoid making either pull out your money out of Kingfisher Airlines completely, so insulate yourself and claim bankruptcy, or you push in money. But in both these scenarios, what you do is that you never adhere to free market practices. What's the policy of free markets? When you interact in a free market or financial market, the idea is that it allocates resources in the best possible manner. If not optimal, it tries to do it as openly as possible, and everybody has a chance to interact in these transactions. The moment you have transfer pricing, that is an internal tube or an internal loop that exists only between these two legal entities, what it does is it keeps everybody else out of the loop. Very similar to information insider trading, where only one person has the ability to check patterns from the outside and nobody else in the financial market has it. Right? It's very similar to that. I think it's a problem. Yeah, go ahead.
How do you keep everyone out of the loop when the profit you make as a result of transfer pricing ultimately goes back to everybody you want to follow?
Here's the idea, right? You don't make a profit out of transfer pricing. What you do is the way you increase profits by transfer pricing is by paying less tax to the government that you're at, the source government that you're pushing money from. And what you end up doing is that, I'll tell you what happens in these meetings. At the end of the end of the financial year, you have things like maintaining brand image, you have global partnership support costs. All of these are terms used by companies to show shareholders where you push money out of from. The initial Partha example, where the US firm pushed money into the India firm. All you have to say in US is that this is a global partnership support cost. We want to have invested money in other branches because we want to maintain brand image. Those kind of things tend to fly with shareholders. What this does, it doesn't give the true picture of why they're really pushing money into India. That is to avoid the $3,000 tax that they could have paid in the US. Right? By showing these costs, by showing compliance costs, by showing global costs and all of this, they have devised a mechanism where they can reduce taxes at all sources and give it to countries where and give it to tax havens where they don't. That's not the reason why those countries set up those tax structures in the first place, but you abuse those tax structures because it's useful to you. You don't want to pay tax in the infrastructure in the country that has given you the infrastructure to start a company. For all those reasons, we're very proud to propose.
Mr. Speaker, I'll jump right into the clashes because I have so much to say about today's debate. So first clash about whether market price or the multinational companies will which side will best achieve efficiency in our economy. And second, the justification behind why transfer pricing can be justified. And third, whether the solvency will occur on their side or not. So moving right into the first clash, whether market price or the multinational corporations will lead to best efficiency in our society. So the only argument coming from their side was how market price will lead to better efficiency and lead to better efficiency in the overall market. Our first response, we see that there have no link why these lack of interventions will somehow lead to a free market, and we have never heard this link why it would ultimately lead to skewed market price in the first place. A second response, we do yes, there may be some instances where free market will be the best way to achieve efficiency, but our deputy leader of opposition has told you that when it comes to these intra companies trade, this is not necessarily so. So we say that we have, by letting these kind of multinational companies do their own conducted their own intertrade and have these transfer trading, we lead to more benefits in the overall economy, and we lead to more efficiency in the whole economy as well. Why so? Because we say that we provide more goods and services and add these kind of value added to during these kind of transfer and during these kind of transactions, and we create more jobs in the overall and in different kind of countries, and we also create those educations and know-hows that other developing countries lack when it comes to these kinds of education, and also we provide them with investments for these countries. So let me clarify what actually transfer pricing does, Mr. Speaker. So when a company A makes like $3,000 as profit, and when a company B, the other branch, makes the same kind of 3,000 profits, and they pay lower tax, and the company A pays higher tax, Mr. Speaker. So you might think that the company B has losing end when they pay for higher tax, and the company A has a winning end when they pay for lower tax, Mr. Speaker. However, if we say that those companies, and at the end of the day, is a same company, and it looks like they have losing and winning ends, but at the end of the day, it's a win-win for both branches, because for both parties, because they're at the end of the day same company, and when they transfer, it becomes a better profit at the end of the day. So we say that when there's a transfer in these kind of goods and products and services, the value added during the transactions actually leads to more efficiency in these kind of transactions, Mr. Speaker. And also when it comes to the kind of jobs they create in the international and other branches, they create more jobs and employment, as our Prime Minister told you. And also about those educations and how, like, as our deputy leader of opposition told you about those BCGs and the know-hows, when they bring these kind of infrastructure and when they bring this kind of know-hows and educations to these developing countries that need these kinds of expertise and educations to begin with, by providing these, they promote these kind of best efficiency when it comes to these education as well. And also about the developing countries, Mr. Speaker, we see that when it comes to these developing countries, they really need these kind of expertise, and they really need kind of these MNCs to come into their country and make them prosper, Mr. Speaker. That's why these developing countries actually lower their taxes and deliberately in order for these MNCs to come to their countries and invest in these countries. So without these MNCs, the developing countries won't be able to really prosper and invest and develop their infrastructures and education and whatnot for the whole greater benefits and for their countries to develop. And about this point, there was no engagement coming from the government side. So if banned, we see that MNCs have less incentives to invest in these kind of developing countries, and less incentives to conduct these kind of transfer pricing and conduct these kind of investments to other countries. And therefore, we see that at the end of the day, it's harmful and it's less efficient for these MNCs to be banned with transfer pricing, Mr. Speaker. So moving on to the second clash about why it's justified, the only argument coming from the government side was that they shouldn't be justified because the state because the states provide them with infrastructure, and the state deserves some kind of payback from the companies, Mr. Speaker. However, we say that on the first level, hey, we're not paying no tax at all, Mr. Speaker. MNCs do actually pay taxes, but even if they do evade these kinds of taxes, Mr. Speaker, we say that the benefits mentioned in the earlier clash and how it adds the value and creates more job and education, these kind of benefits outweigh and compensates and even exceeds these kind of the state provided infrastructure at the end of the day, and we say that this still justifies that our stance. And also, we say that when it comes to these domestic companies, when they try to maximize those efficiency, Mr. Speaker, we say that there's nothing wrong with these kind of domestic companies to actually promote efficiency and strategically market these kind of business strategy in order to maximize efficiency. However, we say that it's also same for the international level, Mr. Speaker, because these MNCs are actually work and compete against each other, and also because they have the justification to maximize their profits and justification to maximize their efficiency and make more profits as possible, we say that justification also exists on our side rather than their side. Also, the last clash about how the solvency, how with whether they will be able to solve these kind of problems or not. First, we didn't really hear substantial harm coming from their side to begin with, and even if there is a substantial harm coming from their side because of those tax evasion and stuff, we see that there's no solvency on their side. Why is this so? Because our deputy leader of opposition have clearly told you that because these corporations want to maximize their profit at the end of the day, we say that without these transfer pricing, they will somehow eventually gonna find a way and eventually find the other ways to be more efficient and evade these kind of taxes, and they will eventually find a way to get away these kind of taxes, and therefore their solvency doesn't exist on their side. However, we told you that the corporations are going to be the best actor when it comes to these transactional activities, and they know the best logistics about their own companies. So therefore, we take all three clashes, and therefore the Korean University takes the big home.
At the end of the debate, I think there are two questions we need to ask. The first is, what exactly do MNCs do in the society? What do they do for the society? And the second question is, what does transfer pricing do to help these MNCs, right? So, first question, what do MNCs do? I think that what we heard from inside the government was that they're evil entities that only care about their own profit, and they're willing to compromise the welfare of citizens, taxpayers, states, or other entities to make money for themselves. I think that when we told you in response to this that, look, on the first hand, when you create that profit as a corporation, as an efficient corporation, the things you do for the society are extremely substantial, especially for MNCs. We've given you numerous analysis, numerous examples, such as about the products or services they can provide for these people. The quality of MNCs and the quality of the products that MNCs create is extremely, extremely different and better compared to other corporations. We think the kind of jobs, or the number of jobs, and the quality of jobs that these MNCs provide to those local branches, to those local subsidiaries, is only possible when you have the huge conglomerate that exists on a very big scale on the international presence. But third, we also told you that, look, they told us that the government raises these kids, raises these employees, and that's the reason these MNCs have their employees in the first place. We told you no. These employees are actually educated and created and fostered by the MNCs, not the state, because they have this expertise, because they have this very, very well and professional understanding of how they should run their business, how they should do certain things, special things in their business, things that you can never learn on a domestic level because you don't have access to the kind of information, kind of expertise, unless this MNC is existing in that area. But we also told you that, look, this MNC does a very, very important role in investing in the economy by creating factories, by creating all these plants and research development centers, all these things, all this investment can never be there unless you have the MNC. So we tell you, why is profit a bad thing when this profit is so important and such a vital part of our economy, vital part of sustaining our countries and our livelihoods and having those good services and products that we never have unless we have those MNCs. We told you that, look, this is especially important when it comes to developing countries because when the MNCs come into these developing countries by creating factories, whatever, through FDI, that is their most important and most dependent source of having this expertise, of having these jobs, of having this very good qualitative products at that cheap price. We think that because when you ban transfer pricing, you're ultimately burdening these developing countries by saying that you can no longer enjoy the benefits of these MNCs. That's a very bad thing for these countries. Well, on the second question of what does transfer pricing exactly do, we think that what they told you was, look, it's just a bad, evasive manner, something that you're not taking responsibility. We told you that, look, when it comes to transfer pricing, no, it's not an evasive thing. It's a certain efficient mechanism that this MNC uses that is only capable because you have international presence. We told you that, look, because this MNC can pursue efficiency, pursue more profits, pursue a better profit at the end of the day through transfer pricing. This is exactly the reason why MNCs can be so competitive, can be so efficient, and can provide these benefits that we've illustrated to you throughout this debate. We told you that, look, even if you ban transfer pricing on their side, you're still going to have the same problem that you try to analyze. Because at the end of the day, these MNCs are still profit-oriented, still want to be efficient, still want to find another loophole that you say that is in the legal system even after you ban transfer pricing. So we told you that because you don't solve the root cause of the problem, the root incentive of these MNCs, you're still going to have the same problem that you're trying to solve. So you don't really solve the problem that you try to analyze. At the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, we told you that, look, MNCs are a good thing. They provide benefits that only MNCs with the international presence can provide. And that kind of benefit can only exist when you have transfer pricing to actually let them maximize efficiency, to actually let them maximize profits at the end of the day. And that's why we are very proud of them.
Three things: efficiency, taxation, and market mechanisms were the themes we discussed, right? They argue that efficiency is important because it generates profits. Our main problem was that we were never able to establish the reason that we tried to solve. In finance, they said we need high capital to generate profits. Transfer pricing and fast transfers of, say, shares being exchanged for money are important for that. Two things. First, they never told me why this same trade or transferring of money because of transferring of shares can't happen at market prices and needs to happen at a price which is decided within the bank. But secondly, the argument wasn't liquidity of the capital. The argument they're trying to make was the high amount of capital. Since they couldn't prove the link between how high number of transfers at a price decided by the bank causes that high capital to happen, that logical link wasn't established. So we can forget financial and economic firms. The next argument was that assembly lines need to produce different things in different spots. Two things. First question we asked was, why do you need to be a separate legal entity, and why can't the same legal entity have the entire assembly line within that same legal entity? I didn't hear the response to that. However, the response to that would have been that an engine is cheaper in Germany, while a car's the car's body might be cheaper in China, which means I want to transfer the engine from Germany and put it into China, right? That probably is true for efficiency. We say that the efficiency should not come at the cost of not transferring the legitimate amount of money from the Chinese entity into the German entity, which means you buy the engine at the market price and not at $1 if it's selling in Germany at $500. Why? Because Germany began its industrial effort to become industrialized 100 years back. A lot of people have put sweat and blood into it. The nation educates its people, creates the infrastructure, keeps the best engineering colleges in its country. It's given you that value that enables you to produce efficient engines at that cost. And it's unfair that if another country like China allows you to have lesser taxes, you get to transfer an engine at $1. And hence, all we said, transfer the goods at a price that's determined by the market and not yourself. So we tell you, A, the reduction in efficiency happens only due to tax. At this point, they say, cool, we've saved taxes, hence efficiency. Idea is this: we want efficiency and we want shareholders to get returns, but it's a chain. The first people we want to reward are the taxpayers, the people who have created the country that allows you to do it. The next is shareholders, etc. So your argument has to be efficiency, but it can't come at the cost of tax evasion. This moves me on to the idea of taxation. Their response was that they create jobs, they do so much good, they bring knowledge to your country. On knowledge, they don't input the knowledge to improve my country, right? When Boston Consulting Group comes, it doesn't try to rehabilitate slums. It takes money from the largest corporates and addresses them not to my country. You have to show the benefit to my country which you weren't able to do. But in the next argument, we argue that even if that's so, who decides it? The state does. The people mandate that, okay, we understand how taxation works. If I reduce taxes, what happens is less social welfare can be done. However, markets can boom because there's more money in everyone's pocket. But who decides the trade-off between these two? The people and the state. In my speech, I asked this question: how is tax evasion fair when the people aren't getting a say in it? It's the state that offers you these things. At which point I offered the alternative. At which point, if the state recognizes it's valuable, we said give tax breaks. At this point, we asked the second question. Because it's a zero-sum game, at the point at which America can't get tax because MNCs start evading, we think they have to generate that same amount of tax from smaller companies. We argue that they create better jobs, they have more outreaching impact, something they never tackled. So we tell you, even on that, it's a larger harm because America starts burdening smaller corporates which don't have similar abilities. What do we argue for? Market mechanisms. The DLO says that the company knows best about its resources, how to transfer them, etc. Exactly. That's what makes it like insider trading. You can change and manipulate things. Example, we told you X company is going to drown, Y company won't. Y company's shares are bought at 5 times the price. When X collapses, those shares get liquidated. Y shares are sold at 1/5 the price. 4/5 of the capital that was kept in X, which should have gone to the tax holders, as I'm sorry I couldn't save your money, at least take this, is now sitting in Y, in the pockets of the rich capitalist. Because of all these reasons, we win.
Yeah, cool.